Hey guys, this is Arie of Pups Unleashed Dog Training. Today I will be teaching you the steps for the basic skill down. This skill is one that a lot of dogs know, and it's one that you can teach to your dog at a very, very young age, and it's usually pretty easy to teach. It has a lot of practical uses. It's one of those skills that's very useful to settle your dog. It can be even more useful than sit sometimes to settle your dog, because not only are they stationary, but they're all the way down to the ground. It's also a jumping off point for the more advanced behavior down stay. So once your dog learns down, then you can teach them the additional skill stay so that you can put them in a down and then they can stay there for a period of time, which can be really good for building independence, getting some time away from your puppy, but then returning back with all sorts of great rewards. So it can be good for that impulse control as well. But just as a basic behavior, it's very, very good for settling and then getting your dog to focus on you or something else if they are engaging in something that you just don't want them to engage in. Before you start training, as always, you want to make sure you have a high value food item on hand. And what's high value will depend on your dog. So try out a few things. You can use their kibble if they're willing to train for it. You can use dog safe human foods like blueberries or carrots or chunks of plain cooked meat or tiny little pieces of cheese or commercial training treats that you get either at the local pet store or grocery store or online. Whatever it is you plan on using, just make sure that it's dog safe and make sure that they like it. Some of those training treats can be cheap, but sometimes dogs won't train for them. So you have to make sure that they like whatever food you're planning on using. To start this behavior, you need 2 small pieces of whatever that food is you're planning on using. Make sure they're chopped into small pieces because we will use a lot, because mastering any sort of skill takes a lot of practice. What you will do is put your dog into a sit, so they do need to know sit before they learn this behavior, and reward the sit with a little piece of food. Then while they are still in the sitting position, you're going to let them sniff that second piece of food and then slowly pull it down towards the ground right between their front paws. Their nose will naturally follow that food because they want that food. And as they get closer and closer to the ground, and one more time, you'll start to see their elbows will bend. Eventually, their elbows will hit the ground as well as having all 4 paws. At that point, you would say yes to mark the proper behavior, and you would feed them that treat. Now, your dog might not go into this position the first few times you try. That's totally fine. We'll talk about that in a minute. But when your dog gets to the point where their elbows hit the ground and all their paws are on the ground, that's where you're going to mark and you're going to release that food. Now, if your dog does not go into that position just by luring them with food, that's actually totally normal. And what we're going to do is break it into smaller steps. So at first, what you're going to do is reward your dog for bending their neck towards the food and not popping their butt up. If their butt pops up at any point when teaching this behavior, you're going to pull the food away and just make some sort of noise to show them that the behavior's done and we're going to try again. So like, is totally fine. Or you can just say nothing and put them back in the sit. That's fine too. When you put them back in the sit to start over, don't reward that second sit because we don't want to start the popping up game where they're just popping up to get another treat. So reward for them craning their neck down towards the food while their butt is still on the ground. If they do not go into that full down position, that's fine. Then you're going to look for the next step there as far as what you can reward. So maybe craning a little bit lower to the ground or bending their elbows. Again, their butt is still not popping up. And you just sort of go like this for a while until your dog gets closer and closer and closer to the ground. Eventually, they will pop all the way down into that down position. But for a lot of dogs, you do have to break it into baby steps like that. And that is totally fine and it's totally normal. So just keep that in mind. Once your dog is consistently going all the way to the ground by using a treat lure, then you're ready for the next step. But when I say consistent, I mean every single time you show them that food and drop it to the ground, they're going into that position. Once that happens, what you're ready to do is start fading out that visible treat. Remember, we do not want to rely on the treat lures for too long because you do not want to run the risk that your dog will only do this behavior if they see food, which is a common training mistake. So what we do for the second step of teaching down is you make that same motion that you were using in step 1 to lure them to the ground, but there's nothing in your hand this time. So you put them in a sit, you give a treat for the sit. You get your empty hand, put it up to their nose, and then drop your hand towards the ground between their two front paws, just like you did before. And you do this, remember, to fade out the visible treat. So as soon as all their paws and their elbows hit the ground in that down position, then you say yes, and you do feed them a treat. But it came from a hidden place, either in your back pocket or a treat pouch or just behind your back. That way they learn that even though they don't see the food, there still might be food somewhere that they can earn. Once your dog will consistently go into the down position with just a hand motion and no treat lure, then we can move to the next step. The next step is adding the word down. So what you're going to do is exactly the same as the previous step, except you are adding the word down before you show the down motion. So you put your dog in a sit, reward the sit. You would say down, and then you put your hand towards the ground as you did before, whatever that hand signal is that you picked. You can also use just pointing to the ground. And when your dog does that, then you say yes, you release the treat, the same as before. This is something, as with the previous steps, you want your dog to get really, really comfortable with before you try to go to the next step. They have to be very, very consistent with it. 5 out of 5 times, they're doing it correctly. Once they are to that point, then you can start to play around with fading out the hand motion. So you're not always relying on that dropping motion or that pointing at the ground. To do this, you will set up the same scenario as before, where you have your food hidden, you put your dog in a sit, reward the sit, then you say down and you pause. Do not immediately give the hand motion. You want to give your dog a chance to show the behavior without the hand motion. And then if you wait about 2 seconds and they have not done it yet, then you can give the hand motion. And if you slowly start to increase the time between when you say down and you give the hand motion, eventually what will happen is that you can just fade out that hand motion altogether. And then you won't actually have to use it. So that's the process there. And it takes different dogs different amounts of time as far as how long it takes to fade that hand motion out. Once you've done that, then the hard work is done and you just start to practice with distractions. You start to practice in new situations so that you can use it in other places and other situations besides the place you originally trained it. So maybe you trained it in the living room. Well, now it's time to go in the kitchen and the bedroom and the basement and in the backyard and on a walk and wherever else you might use this. Pet store, friends' houses, all of that. You need to generalize this behavior by practicing in different settings, and you need to practice with distractions. Your dog will never be able to do this while distracted if you don't first practice with distractions. So strategically look for things like, all of a sudden, there's a cat in the room. Well, I still need to train, and I still need my dog to be able to listen when there's a cat around. So what do? Grab the training treats and start training in that situation. Capture those little distractions and make them teachable moments, and it will go so far for you and for your dog. Now, there are some areas where this behavior is likely to go awry during training. So these are my troubleshooting tips for teaching the behavior down. The most common area where this behavior goes awry is actually step 1, getting your dog to go completely into the down position. This, for some reason, is difficult for some dogs. A lot of dogs will just plop right down to the ground, especially young puppies. They're so bendable and flexible. A lot of times when you go to drop the treat to the ground, they just completely collapse. But there are some dogs that do not like to be in this position for whatever reason, so it is much harder to get them all the way to the floor. And honestly, that can be the hardest part of training, is just step 1 for this. So if you have one of those dogs, please remember, there's nothing wrong with them. Every dog is different, and for some dogs, for whatever reason, this is a hard behavior. We just break it into baby steps. So reward the smallest inclination that you have that your dog is at least moving in the right direction. So they are bending their head a little bit to follow the treat without popping their butt up. That's a great way to first start rewarding for this. So say yes and release, and then make them bend a little bit further before you say yes and release. Once you start to see their elbows crumpling or their legs sort of bending towards the ground, you know they're almost there. Reward for that, and then just keep going until they eventually hit the ground. I've had a lot of dogs that learn to do this in 5 minutes. I've had some dogs that it literally took weeks of training sessions to get them to this point because they just don't like that behavior. And at that point, you have to decide, is this something that your dog needs to know or not? But it's just patience and working at your dog's pace. You never want to make it something that's not fun. So if they're struggling with it, do something a little bit easier and circle back to it. Another common area where people have issues is getting their dog into that position and then not popping up. So you want to be sure that when you go to reward for the down position, your dog is still in that position when you give them the food. If they go all the way down to the floor and then they pop up to get their treat, they're actually learning that the behavior is lay down and pop up. They're not learning that the behavior is lay down. So you want to be careful with that. Feed the treat as they're on the ground, and if they pop up, that's where you kind of pull the treat away and you start over again so that they learn that there's some pretty strict criteria there. They need to be all the way down on the ground and they need to stay there to receive their treat. Another issue that sometimes comes up in teaching this is actually fading out that treat lure. So your dog can do it fine when they're following a treat, but they have a really hard time doing it when there's nothing in your hand. So that's where you can be creative. You can rub the treat on your hand so your hand smells like the food if that works. You can also do really fast repetitions. First with food in your hand, and then one of those times don't have a piece of food in your hand but make the same exact motion. That works really well too. And then another just tip that I have is if your dog is one of those dogs that does not want to go all the way to the down position and you've been struggling for a while, you don't know what else to try, you can also try something called the leg tunnel, which is where you sit on the ground, stretch your legs out flat in front of you, and then pull your knees up so your legs are kind of in this position, almost like an inverted V. And then you put the treat underneath your leg, and your dog has to almost army crawl through your leg to get the food. That can sometimes require them to go into the down position because you only put your legs up high enough that your dog has to army crawl through to be able to get the treat. So you can also use that to try to just get them used to being in that position, and every time that they do it, you can give them a treat if they're going all the way to the ground. And then that makes it a little bit easier to do the other training steps. So those are the top issues that I have come across as far as teaching down. If you have any more, feel free to drop a comment down below with your question, and then I can respond back with some tips if you're having an issue different than the one that I described. As always, guys, please like and subscribe. We will have more training videos coming out soon, all sorts of training tips and just fun special topics. So please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.